it is a remarkable and incredible thing to witness and to be with the first female Supreme Court justice in our country's history. I really think this is an incredible moment for me to have a chance to talk to you. I think in 2022, when you were elevated to the Supreme Court, I think many people in this room, I know women, but also men, dads, brothers, sons, and of course, daughters, wives, sisters. The whole country, I think, could see that the last frontier almost of leadership in this country, and this is the Leaders in Islamabad Summit, the last frontier of leadership in terms of a gender wall really was the superior judiciary. And you've broken that down, inshallah, for hundreds and thousands of and millions of young girls and women and brilliant lawyers. So I'm very excited. Justice Saiba, I'm not sure whether it should be Justice Saiba or Madam Justice. Maybe you can clarify that. But I want to start off with kind of how we got here and how you got here, if you don't mind, because I think your personal life story and your journey to becoming a judge, from being a superstar lawyer and one that was very, very good at the stuff that you guys all do, which is running corporate organizations, raising money, spending money, making money. The justice used to be a very, very, like I said, superstar lawyer. And then the transition to the Lahore High Court, and almost a decade there, and now the last 3 years at the Supreme Court. If you don't mind, I want to stop talking, and I just want to hear in your words what that journey's been like, where you started, what the key sort of highlights were for you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the introduction. And Assalamu alaikum. I'm feeling a little out of sorts with so many people with a lot of knowledge here. So, and I don't know the context, but anyway, to answer your question. Law has always been something I've been very passionate about from way back when. And I've always seen myself as somehow being involved with law. As I grew older, law became something that would give me a voice for those who were marginalized and those who needed a voice. I joined a corporate law firm, but my primary area of focus was litigation, in which I did a lot of corporate work, but I also focused on just getting relief for, like I said, people who found it difficult to find their voice in the system. Ultimately, in 2012, I was asked to become a judge of the Lahore High Court. And at that time, the Chief Justice, Justice Azmat Saeed, as he was then, he made a very interesting statement. He said, we need someone like you to come and rattle this male cage and tell us what we're doing wrong. And that's what got me thinking that what does this mean and what does he expect me to do? So I ultimately did agree, and it took some persuasion, but I did agree, and I became a judge of the Lahore High Court. A lot of resistance, a lot of surprising resistance. Not only, I think, the gender played a part, but also because I am the unknown. I am the unknown because my gender is not seen on the bench, it's not seen in the courtroom, it's not seen everywhere where decisions are being made. So when you have to deal with an unknown, it scares people. And because it scared them, they weren't sure, who is she? Where is she from? इसकी बरादरी क्या है? इसका लंगोटिया यार कौन है? ये किधर बड़ी हुई है? इसके साथ connections कौन? They didn't know me. I was the unknown. And that unknown is, I think, what saved me. Because as I progressed through my judicial career, a lot of challenges with a lot of opportunities. But I think the resistance slowly evolved into people accepting me. And probably my biggest, I think, what I won't call it success, but the biggest achievement that I feel is that I created space for myself. Space in a totally male-dominated world. And I think for many of the men sitting here, you cannot really relate to what I'm saying because you don't have to fight for your space. But as a woman, when you're in the courtroom and you're the only woman there, you do have to fight for your space. You have to fight for attention. You have to fight for acknowledgement. You have to fight for someone to pay attention to you, and most important, for respect. And I often tell people that when I go somewhere in my car and I would get out of the car, I would be asked, Judge Saab nahi aaye? Judge Saab kidhar hai? So people couldn't associate the gender with the judge. But as the journey progressed, it became better. My space sort of started taking ground. And a very senior and seasoned lawyer of Pakistan once gave me a very good compliment in court and said, Madam, you're the best male lawyer that we have, judge that we have on the bench. And I took it as a compliment, not because I thought, he's equating me with a man, but what he meant was that I had all the fundamentals and that the system was ready to accept me. So the journey continued, good challenges, good opportunities, and then came the moment of the Supreme Court, and once again, a rocky road to the Supreme Court. Once again, the challenge of acceptability coming around. It took 6 months for my decision to go through, and I haven't looked back since.
No, you haven't at all. I think when you said that, and of course, being a sitting judge, I think all of us respect and understand that you must speak in a circumspect manner. But I don't have that constraint, so you'll forgive me for the informality. I mean, it seems like, the fact that you said you were an unknown and that saved you, it didn't just save you, I think it saved a lot of women from a lot of indignity, because some of the things that you did as a judge were very, very forthright and direct. The virginity test case and that's not just one, there's several such cases where you brought things into the public domain at the high court level that people could not have imagined that would be discussed in the way that they were during the trial, during the conversation, and then your own judgment and how clear it was. Did you do that deliberately? Was there a specific intent in your mind that, hey, these guys don't know what's about to hit them, they don't know me, which is great, now I'm gonna go out and really change stuff? Or was it more of an evolution? How much planning was there in some of the bolder things that you did?
There's no planning at all. It's evolving. A case is a case. You look at the case. I'm highly motivated by challenging questions of law. So you look at those questions, and this particular case, the two-finger test, it's really during the hearing and what I was being told by the system and by the petitioners with reference to the test that really got me thinking that what's missing. And so that's one of the things that I talk about, is that what we are missing is a narrative, a gender perspective. So when you're missing a gender perspective, when you're missing a gender narrative, you are making laws and policies and requiring women to conform to something without really hearing their voices, without really thinking about what their needs are, what their lived experiences are. The two-finger test is precisely that. Without understanding women, you're conducting a virginity test and relying on that for determining whether a woman has been raped or not. So my gender played a major role in that. And with that came the rude awakening to realize that we've become so numb to these sensitivities that even the women in the system were relying on a two-finger test and didn't really know why they were relying on it. So today, I believe I stand for, and I reflect, I talk about a gender perspective, a gender narrative. If you are not going to include the voices and the stories of the women in your lawmaking, in your policy making, if you're not going to go back to the women to see how these matters impact them, you're not going to do justice to them either, because you're really doing something which you're telling them to conform to. It's not participation, it's not engaging, and you'll never get compliance because there is a big gap.
I think I'd like to just explore this a bit further, this theme of kind of narratives of change. I mean, one thing that's very clear from the discussions, even this morning, is that, we have a lot to be grateful for in this country and a lot to look forward to, I think, in terms of the opportunities General Zubair was talking about. But it's also true that Pakistan is not really solving a lot of problems that many countries with similar or even worse starting points and challenges have been able to solve. And it seems to me that, this is a great example of where there was an archaic, almost medieval way of doing something. Nobody thought to challenge it precisely because that narrative and that representation was missing. And then it was not missing and it got solved. But I guess my counter challenge to you, and again, I say this with great fear of a sitting judge of the Supreme Court, but my counter challenge to you using this platform and this forum and your grace is, do we have to wait for an Aisha Malik in every single vertical? Or is there something else that we could do to forge narratives of change? How do we go from things that aren't moving, problems that aren't being solved, to evolving them? Because I feel like almost if we have to rely on Justice Aisha Malik or equivalents, A, there aren't that many, maybe there are no equivalents, and B, that's very random. The system is not responsible for producing you. This is the grace of God, a little bit of good luck. So I think all of us would want something more certain than just luck to define the future.
So it's a good question because it gives everybody the opportunity to introspect and see what their role is. I work in the judiciary, and that's really seen as a last resort where anything happens. So you go to the judiciary as a last resort when you're unable to resolve your dispute. So that's one narrative that needs to be understood and that needs to be built. We are the opposite. We are the first place that someone will go where there's a dispute. And things which are administrative, which are really not dispute worthy, come into the court for a reason, and that reason has to be understood. So from what marks someone should get in an exam, to a billing dispute, to pension, to pay, to allowance, to land dispute, everything comes to court. We litigate on everything. So for me, the fundamental question is that why do we litigate so much? And my years of 13 years on the bench suggest that we litigate, or the people litigate a lot because, one, there's a trust deficit where enforcement, execution is concerned. Secondly, the service that is provided by governance. I look at governance as service providing. The service that is provided, it's not facilitative. It's just there. And it takes time, it's time consuming, and again, it's not in sync with the narrative. It's not in sync with the needs of the people. It's not in sync with the real issues. So if a person comes to court to say, it's been 1 year, I've retired, and my pension is not being paid, I mean, you think, what do you mean pension is not being paid? Why is it so difficult? When you call the system and say, why aren't you paying the pension? You find out that the reasons are very trivial. Now, those trivial reasons can be addressed in-house. Those trivial reasons can be addressed very quickly. They don't need to come to court. And the same goes with, the smaller aspects. Courts are there as a last resort to resolve disputes where you can't resolve the dispute in any manner. However, we've sort of become the first stop that everybody wants to come to in the hope that they will resolve all and any disputes. And what happens is you burden the system, you burden the court, and there's too much reliance on the judiciary, which is not really required.
I think this is a brilliant point. The litigiousness that we associate with this society, you very, I think, brilliantly laid out that it's not necessarily that society and the people are litigious in nature, it's that their interaction with the system, one, has a trust deficit, as you explained, and second, people that should be getting things automatically or with ease are having to really struggle to get them. And so obviously that creates friction and that generates these caseloads. Now, some of these caseloads, I've looked at the numbers, I mean, they were insane after the lawyers' movement, and there was some promise that would generate relief. And we've had a few chief justices that have focused on this. There's been some progress, to be fair, but frankly, if you look at the numbers even today, the caseloads, they're not manageable. I would even go so far as to maybe ask you, Justice Sahiba, even with the miracle of God and solving the caseload down to zero tomorrow, you still would be facing a society that is constantly generating the same caseload. So what are the things, I know you've done a lot of work on arbitration, but maybe talk to us a little bit about dispute resolution and arbitration as tools, because the obvious one is, of course, public sector reform, administrative reform, greater fiscal discipline, more money on services. We all know those, and I think everybody agrees, but specifically on arbitration and dispute resolution, are those spaces that can help us address the litigiousness that we've kind of artificially almost adopted in our culture?
Absolutely. Arbitration, mediation, ADR, dispute resolution. This is an absolute must, particularly if you want to encourage investment, you want to encourage business, because going to court means time, and any dispute will take time, and there's a whole process of appeal, and then, so on. So that takes a lot of time, and time is money. And so if your money is going to be stuck up for so long, that may not be conducive to good business. So arbitration or dispute resolution is important. But we have to remember there are two types of disputes. There are disputes between private parties, that's one aspect, and then there are disputes of people with different departments of the government. Now that's the dispute part that really needs attention. Complaint redressal cells within departments are important, and there are some, particularly in the Punjab, but again, they work slowly. So if someone has applied for a job, has not gotten the job, opts to go to the complaint redressal cell in 2015, by the time that dispute is decided, it's 2019. By the time it comes into my court, it's 2025. 10 years down the line, the policy has changed, the requirements have changed. What do you do with that dispute? So timely resolution of any dispute is very important. And when you do old cases today, you see how frustrating it must be for the litigant who came to court with a dispute of monetary value, say 1,000, 2,000 rupees, which back in the day was a lot of money, but today is worth nothing. So timely resolution is important, and I think more efficiency. We have to be more efficient in the way we give out service. At the moment, I think this service building narrative is missing. We don't see it as a service, we see it as something we have to do. And for me, if you're not providing people, if you're not engaging with people, if you're not facilitating them, you're not going to get a positive response from them. So systems can't be built just by wishing them to be built. Systems are built when the people for whom you build them have faith in that system. And you have to build narratives for that faith to be there and for the system to work.
Earlier, you might have noticed that the Minister for Privatization was on the stage, and he did something that a lot of us do, when it comes to issues of the economy. He perhaps rightly, he complained about the courts, needing to be quicker and be more effective. I think this dynamic is really, it's an overhang in these conversations, right? It's clear that there need to be reforms and public sector changes, improved governance, better performance in terms of getting to the problem and solving it before it comes to the courts. But talk to us a little bit about perhaps the discussions within the court, whether the High Court or the Supreme Court, about what avenues senior judges in the country see for doing whatever it is that they can do to kind of ease the pain and mitigate against, I think a generic frustration with the system, and that of course includes the judiciary.
I think I'll give two answers. There's a lot of discussion within the judiciary for reform, and a lot of discussion on seeing how to do case management, time management, and disposal of cases. That's one aspect of it. The second, there is a lot of engagement also with the government through the Advocate General or the Attorney General's office to see how to deal with issues that are pertinent and relevant for the government. There is the use of technology, even discussions on AI. That's all being done. But again, at the end of the day, the issues of the judiciary should be resolved by the judiciary. The issues of governance should be resolved by the government. If I'm going to keep blaming the government and saying it's because they're not doing their job that I get the caseload, and they keep blaming me that it's because I'm not doing my job, then we're in a loop. And that loop is not going to help anybody. At the end of the day, I repeat, what I say, we have to build new narratives. We have to build narratives that engage with the people and are the narratives of the lived experiences of people. It's easy to say we should do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and not actually do them. And I give an example. We litigate a lot on taxation. And taxation is a subject that's in the court a lot. Now you have to try and understand, why are we litigating on taxation? The way I see it, and I've done a lot of work in taxation, is that there's no buy-in to the system. The taxpayer doesn't really understand, appreciate, or want to pay the tax. And the system wants to extract the tax. And it's always seen as an extraction, and forceful and unfair extraction. And the reason is because a narrative has never been built of this partnership between the state and the citizen, where the citizen has to pay the tax, the state has to take the tax money, because what's missing is, where's that money going? What's the accountability of that money? Where's the governance? I don't see it. And so every taxpayer comes to say this is unfair. Then there seems to be a disbalance in who's being taxed and who's not being taxed. And again, it requires better understanding. You cannot expect every person and any ordinary person to just appreciate the decisions that are being taken somewhere in some room which have no connection with them. So salaried people will always have the same argument that because we are salaried and it's easy to extract money from us, we become the first point where you extract it. People who have wealth and property will say this seems to be an easy place. So at the end of the day, what does that conversation break down into? That money is being extracted from where it's easily extracted, and anyone who has that kind of money, you can extract it from them in the form of tax. For me, the question is that why isn't there a buy-in to the system? Why isn't the system creating a narrative which makes people understand? And narratives are not built overnight. Narratives takes time. It takes decades to build narratives. I don't think we've really built a narrative. And just the other day in a case, while hearing the FBI, I was telling them that, this is not like a bounty hunt that you're on. You're not looking for people that I'll take money from here, take money from there. This is an obligation on that person. You have to give them space to understand their obligation, to litigate it, to give closure to the decision, and to pay the tax. But when you start going into this extraction mode, you don't get the buy-in. And on literature, on taxation, you will see everywhere, it talks a lot about the relationship between the taxpayer and the government, where you have to build a strong bond where it's understood what's happening with the money, and the taxpayer doesn't agitate on everything.
Madam Justice, I have to say I'm struck by the way in which you've explained things, and your manner is perfectly judicial and judicious in the way that perhaps I haven't heard before in a couple of these instances. We have very little time left, and I've already been warned. This clock actually that you see, that the audience doesn't see, is actually -5. But I did promise the organizers that I think this privilege that I've enjoyed, I'd like to have maybe 3 questions or comments from the audience. But whether it's a question or a comment, just one pre-warning. There are many issues that animate and agitate our imagination related to the judiciary. That's not what we're here to discuss today. So, of course, when you are receiving the mic, please be mindful of both time and the dignity and standing of the office that Justice Asha Malik represents. I'm grateful in advance. I have the first question from my brother over there who's standing up. I'd like to see a female participant pose a question to the judge if it's possible. But I'll quickly take you as the first question. 1.5 sentence comment or question with your introduction as well.
This is Mohammad Anas Khan. What an absolute pleasure asking this question from Justice Aisha. Very simple question. What are the top 3 suggestions that you think that, in terms of reforms, what are the top 3 reforms our judiciary system needs? This is a very simple question.
Excellent. Before you answer the question, I want to take on 2 more questions. Why don't you answer that question?
So I think the top issues that are being worked on are case management, are digitalization so that we become more technology based. And the third is also to make the system more rule based. So that there are rules within that the judiciary follows within its own internal practices. These are the three things that currently are being worked on and are also important.
Excellent. We'll take the second question here, sir. Someone turn on the mic, please.
And I work in tech. Thank you for a wonderful interview from both of you. It was fantastic. My name is Brendan McKittrick. I was born in Ireland. I hold a POC for Pakistan, very proudly, thanks to my wife from Karachi. I hope to hold a passport one day. Now, at the moment, a man can get a passport for his wife, but a woman can't get a passport for her husband. So I hope if it comes to your desk one day, maybe you can see that fit.
I gotta say, I did not see that one coming, but let's give this man a round of applause. And madam, this is now, our fandom of you is now hinging on a solution to this problem, inshallah, as well, because our sisters, mothers, daughters, wives should have the same privileges as us men do. The third question, I apologize for ignoring this side of the room, but Khurram Rahat Bhai had his
There's a
hand
lady
up.
there.
Is there a lady as well? Fantastic. So we'll take the lady first, and Khurram Bhai, you can wrap it up. You'll get the bonus question. Ma'am, your question, please. Let's get a mic to the honorable guest.
Assalamualaikum. Am I audible?
Whoop.
Oh, where's that?
Here.
Oh, are you asking a question?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Assalamualaikum, Justice Aisha. First of all, I'm extremely proud to actually see you on stage today, being a woman myself. So it gives me immense pleasure and delight. I once went to a lower court in Lahore. So my question is that the environment over there, I kind of felt the most unsafe that I have ever felt, I guess, in my entire life in Pakistan. The people over there, even the lawyers, everything. So just the general environment. Being a female, I felt so uncomfortable. And of course, being a female, if ever I get into something legal, I would want to go to the court and, fight for my case and be there and discuss it with the lawyer. You are actually, at the apex court now, and being a female, can you please do something to make sure that the environment, in the courts are a little female, so that if we ever have to go to a court, feel safe and there's a professional environment that we can deal in. Thank you very much.
That's an excellent question. And I can tell you in the discussion with Justice Saiba yesterday, I had said maybe I should open with the question, Madam, as a Supreme Court Justice, how much control do you have over district and sessions courts across the country? I'll let the Justice answer the question herself.
So, point noted, and it's a common feeling for many people, not just women, even for men, even for young children. It's not the best of environments. It is a tough and very harsh environment. But then courts are not supposed to be a place where you go and feel nice and cozy and welcomed. Nonetheless, we are working on it. This is, there's a lot of training on gender sensitization, on improving conditions. But I think, like I said, the primary focus has to be on understanding what the needs are, which requires a gender narrative. On my part, we have conversations with women judges. We work with all judges to explain to them how to be more gender sensitive, how to understand, particularly in family cases, the issues. So yes, we are working on it, and it's a structural requirement as well as a training requirement, as well as an awareness requirement, as well as a mindset requirement. So mindset is a big challenge. We have to get people to change the way they think in order to give you the kind of environment you want, but work in progress.
I'll also just quickly add, for the benefit of the questioner, that A, was a brave and courageous question. B, we cannot put all of these things on the shoulders of the one, sort of first female Chief Justice. And as a man, and as many men in the room, I think this is something we have to introspect on and internalize and normalize in our own thinking. So as a man, as a Pakistani man, I'm ashamed of the fact that Pakistani women feel the way they do in those spaces or in any spaces, and we have to do a lot better. Final question to you, Khurram Bhai.
Justice Sahiba, my question relates to today's topic, navigating the unknown. A lot of time when whatever we hear about judiciary and cases, there's always reference to the past precedences in the legal fraternity. So, would like to hear from you of an instance or how where you have come across a case where there wasn't a past reference, so you were kind of navigating in the unknown, and how did you address that in terms of giving your judgment?
So thank you. That's a very nice question. There are many cases, and like I said, a good legal challenge is something that motivates me and encourages me to continue doing what I do. So while I have many cases to reference, but I'll give one particular one. While in the Lahore High Court, I found that there are a lot of petitions put up by farmers who claim their money for the sugar cane that they've sold to sugar factories. And I noted that this is something that is repeated every year. There are a large number of people who come, and these are poor farmers. They're not people, they come to court for the money that they want for the cane that they have sold. Along with that, there are problems that the factory has borrowed money from banks. So there's mortgage, there's pledge, there's loans. And so at the end of the day, when you look at a way or a solution, everything was in the ownership of the bank, as the bank would say, and the farmer was complaining that they were not getting their money, and not getting their money for years on end. It's not a debt that was settled after a year or two. So this particular case that came to my court, the farmers had not gotten their money for 15 years. 15 years, the debt had accumulated for the farmers and was much bigger than the debt of the banks. Now, I had the farmer in the court, I had the banks in the court, and I had two competing rights. The bank's version was that everything is mortgaged with us, so we have the right, the first right as creditors to first take the money, and so if we sell everything, even that doesn't settle our debt. The farmer said, I don't know all of this debt language and pledge language, but they took the cane from me and they have to pay. There was no solution that I could find in our books. And after doing a lot of research, I do a lot of my own research, I looked at the produce market around the world. And I discovered that the farmer can be given a claim on the produce that the farmer has sold to the sugar cane, to the sugar factory, and will retain title on that produce until the debt is paid off. So in my mind, I had drawn a Venn diagram. So I had the bank's rights and I had the farmer's rights and this gray space in the middle. And that's what my judgment did. It covered the gray space and said that the bank may have been mortgaged the property, but the right of title stays with the cane grower until the sugar is paid off, because the cane grower retains title in the sugar, even if ultimately that sugar becomes a biscuit or a lollipop. You have to pay. The debt is known, it's quantified, it's dated, everything is there. So the debt has to be paid off. So it was a new judgment, something new. And I'm happy to say that the result was good, because the amount of petitions that came were reduced. The Supreme Court upheld the judgment, and you don't really now see this problem anywhere. So it's really thinking out of the box and using the law as best as you can. There are many, many examples, but that's what my job is. My job is to look for solutions, just like everybody else here is looking for solutions. But I think what's fundamental to all of this, what my experience has shown to me, is we really have to move towards science and data, and we have to work with information and knowledge, and we have to come to decisions which engage with people. I have to know what you want, what your case is, what your issues are, for me to be able to deliver a judgment. So in the same way, the lawmaker, the policymaker must know what the needs are, must engage, and that's how I believe narratives are built.
Madam Justice Saiba, I want to thank you again, not just for that, but for the whole experience of this conversation. As the first female Supreme Court Justice, you've been navigating the unknown, not just at the Supreme Court, but even before that. And thank you for kind of a masterclass in how to do that. I think this was really an epic example of reflections of a leader. And along with General Zubair Mahmood Hayat, both conversations to me were incredibly insightful. I learned a lot from them. I hope that the audience was also able to learn a lot about leadership and a little bit about you. I'm so grateful that you were so open and welcoming to this experience. I must also thank the audience for the quality and tenor of the questions, exceptional. And I'm so proud of everybody that's here and so proud to be associated with Asfar and Rabia and the whole team at Nutshell that have put this together. This was really, for me, this was a privilege and I thank you all for it.